they come to an event here, they will find highly skilled people, very sharp, who are ready to learn and ready to share, and that's what's important for them. So that's why they support us. So this is your place, your home. Don't hesitate to use it. It's free. Every weekday from 9 to 5, you can come and co-work here on the ground floor. It's free. If you want to extend your stay here, you need a badge. And that badge gives you that's like a flex co-working, and it gives you then 7 days a week, 24 hours by 24, access to the building. And that's mainly used by the people who are already launching their idea or starting to work on their idea, and who are regrouping people. And when you regroup people, they go into meeting rooms or upstairs in our project pods. So that's what we do. And I wish you a very pleasant evening. I'm sure it's going to be very, very interesting. One more thing, the data science community is now called the AI for Belgium and Data Science Community. So we hopped on that train and helped the AI for Belgium as well. And we are organizing our annual conference on the 26th of June at the University of Brussels. And there you will have the opportunity in one day to choose amongst 30 different one-hour workshops, either on very technical issues or management issues all around data, or a big series about 40 presentations on the topic. The topic of this year is being human in the age of AI. So I wish you a very pleasant evening. Thank you.
Okay, so I still have to intervene shortly to introduce Nathalie. Well, perhaps first, legal hackers, for the people who don't know what the legal hackers are, briefly. We are a community that is basically global in nature, because it started in Washington, somewhere between a lawyer and a tech guy who was talking to each other and saying the combination or the overlap of what we are doing is so big and we don't understand what the other one is doing. Shouldn't we do something to improve the knowledge of what the other party is doing in terms of technical skills on the one hand and legal skills on the other hand. And they promoted that as a legal hacker driving force throughout the world. And I think now there's about 150 or so chapters around the world, and Brussels is one of them. Not Belgium, Brussels, because Brussels is better known outside of Europe. They know Brussels, they have no idea where Belgium is. So that's why we took Brussels as a lead title for our community here. Caroline started it in the end of 2016, so we're about in our third year now, and we try to regularly organize meetups that relate to the crossroads of technology and the law. And with regard to AI, personally, I only know it from the sci-fi first, where the AI is non-existing at present, but omnipresent in the movies. And that, of course, triggers the interest of a young guy. And then if you, in the latest few years, see that we got our computers to learn themselves to play chess, Go, poker, League of Legends. I don't know what the game is, but apparently a very hard strategic game, and the computers beat the best teams in the world. So then you get intrigued and you look, okay, do we have experts in Belgium who know something about that? And I got, I think somewhere at the end of last year already, in contact with Nathalie, and I saw you're working on law and AI. What are you doing about that? Could you come and join us? And she said, well, I'm kind of busy right now. I didn't really understand what she was doing at the time, but she was already working on what she's going to come and present this evening, because the European Union is looking at a strategy how to tackle AI. They have commissioned a few people to work on that, and Nathalie is one of the leads, because she's a coordinator. She is one of the leads in that research for knowledge on how to deal with AI. And she's coming to talk to us on what the mission is, what they have up till now, and what the future will bring. That's what I understood of the presentation. So Natalie, you can read it on the screen obviously. She works for the KU Leuven and for DG Connect, so the European Commission basically. And I hear that's a tough balance to maintain. But you'll see that it gives results if she's working on it. So Natalie, please go ahead.
I think I need to turn this on, huh?
Yes.
At some point. Can you point me how to do that?
Yeah. You have to push that thingy. Oh, you have a different one? It's in the middle?
Does that work? Yeah. Okay, great. So thank you for the very kind introduction. So Tommy already explained what I'm going to do here today. Please, at any point, just raise your hand and interrupt me if you have questions. I think that's easier than just keeping it all until the end, and I'll ask you some questions as well. So just, raise your hand and let's not be too formal about this, if you don't mind. So that's on our program today. I'm going to give a very brief overview of the background of what the European Commission is doing around AI. And then I'll give a very brief ethics 101. Why? Because we hear so much today about AI ethics, but people don't necessarily know what we mean when we talk about AI ethics. And I'll try to make the link to the policy making around that to clarify why it's useful to also understand not just AI, but the ethics part of it. I'll then dive into the ethics guidelines for trustworthy AI. So that's a document that at the European Commission we prepared with the high-level expert group. I'll briefly say something about the second document that this expert group is doing. These are the policy and investment recommendations. And then we'll go to what's in the future, as Tommy said. So my first slide is always this background slide, because I come here, so I also work for KU Leuven, where I do research on the legal and ethical questions around AI. But I'm standing here today mostly from the policymaker perspective. And, policymakers, it's not new, but, typically whatever the file is, and it's the same for AI, you constantly get lobby groups or interest groups telling you, oh, you should really regulate. Or, it will come back. Or, no, please don't regulate yet, you will kill all innovation, right? So those are the two sides that you often hear. And, people, companies, organizations, they come to us and they come to explain all the reasons why we really, really need to act, or why please don't act yet. That's a bit the balance. And, it's like that for all files. And for AI, it's not different. You can even imagine that for AI right now, it's a very hot topic to do lobbying on. So for regulators, we need to keep in mind that it's a technology that evolves very fast, like many new technologies. So that makes it very difficult if you then want to, construct policy around that. You need to keep that in mind. You need to make sure that whatever action you undertake, it's still relevant, also when the technology evolves, which it does very fast, even after few months, not talking about years. So it's a challenge for regulators of how to deal with that. I'm not gonna lie about it, it's a challenge, and we don't have all the answers, right? We know that the impact of AI is multifold. So it's great, that a lot of people are interested in AI from a technical, scientific perspective, and a lot of advances there. But we also know that it can have a potentially negative impact, to phrase it very carefully. And we know that impact can happen on different domains. So it can have legal impact, ethical impact, social impact, economic impact, psychological impact. And you need to try to map those different impacts if you want to do any policing in that domain, right? And that also means that you need people with the right skills to map that impact. So that we know. We also know that AI is context specific. The ethical issues that are raised by an AI system that recommends you a song will not be the same ethical issues as an AI system that recommends you, a treatment, a medical treatment that could potentially save your life or not, right? So it also doesn't make sense to apply hard rules which are the same for those two applications, for instance. But there might be some level of rules where you say, okay, this should apply for all AI systems, and the GDPR is actually a good example of that, because regardless of the sector or the area, the GDPR applies, right? But then you can think of having a mix between horizontal rules, whether those are binding rules or guidelines, and sectorial rules, right? Or application-specific rules. So that's also something that we need to take into account. And then, the final point, we know that we don't have all the answers, so we need to be a bit humble, right? We need to learn as we go, and we need to understand that, sure, it's okay to take action, especially if we think that there is a need for that, but we need to make sure that if we undertake action, we do it in such a way that we can easily, flexibly adapt course if we notice that it doesn't go the way we expect it to go. Because that's the only way to deal with technology that develops so fast at the end of the day, right? And last point, and to me that's maybe one of the most important ones, we need a multi-stakeholder, multidisciplinary approach. You cannot tackle the challenges that AI brings or the opportunities that AI brings by only sitting in a closed circle of computer scientists or engineers or lawyers in between them. We need to bring those people together, because otherwise, as I said, you cannot do this mapping of all the impacts. Because the action that you take from the legal perspective will have consequences from an innovation perspective, from a social perspective. So if we want to be smart about this, which we have to be, we need to bring all those areas of expertise together, and we need to have people talking to each other and finding a common language, because that's perhaps the most difficult. Figuratively, finding a common language between peoples of different disciplines.
Is that something typically European to take that approach? Because I can imagine that Americans, and particularly Trump, wouldn't mind making mistakes, and multi-stakeholder, if he's able to tweet about it. So is that something typically European?
The multi-stakeholder, yes. So the multi-stakeholder, it's a model that is applied, more generally in the European Union. We have this approach that for every piece of legislation that is adopted, for instance, there is a stakeholder consultation. And the idea is then to reach a wide number of stakeholders from different areas who then give feedback on whether it makes sense or not for their application or for their sector. Our expert group is very diverse. You also have expert groups consisting of only lawyers, if it's really a legal problem that they want to look at. But then in one way or another, they do try to get also the feedback of others. What is less typically traditionally European is this approach that I mentioned, where we need to be humble, we need to learn as we go, and we need to not act too fast with regulation, because let's say the cliché is that China and the US, they develop technology and they deploy technology, and Europe regulates technology, right? So that is not very European to first see step by step. Let's try things, let's pilot things, let's see how it goes. On the other hand, if there is a need to act, it makes sense to act, and it makes sense to make binding regulation. And with the GDPR, a lot of people said that Europe was completely crazy to adopt any binding regulation on it, that it would kill all innovation, that Europe can only regulate. But now countries around the world are thinking about adopting their own GDPR. So yes and no, I would say. EU strategy on AI. So this one came out last year in April 2018, and it consists of 3 pillars. You might already be familiar with that. So the idea was to have a holistic approach, to tackle all these pillars at the same time. So the first pillar, which is also very important for what is happening here actually, is boosting the uptake of AI. That means boosting innovation, investment, bringing also investment together at member state level to leverage that, but also ensuring that companies and organizations have the competences, have the skills, have the know-how to do that. So how many of you are familiar with the term digital innovation hubs? So this is also something that fits into that picture. Those are hubs across member states that are meant to offer advice, guidance, help, also especially to smaller companies, on how they could use AI or other digital technologies, how it can help them to digitalize, to make their own business model more efficient. So this is something that fits under that one. Because if you compare the development and use of AI in Europe with how it happens in China or in the US, we are very far behind. right? It's not a secret. It doesn't mean we have to do it their way. We can do it our own way. We have, our own view on how the technology should develop, and that's fine. But if we want to have a say on how the technology should develop, we also need to develop it ourselves, right? Because the ideal is that you set a standard, and that standard, in our case would be a certain ethical standard as well with values. But you can only set that standard if you also play a role on actually developing and using the technology. So that's a little bit the idea of that. Then the second pillar, tackling socio-economic challenges and changes. So that is very much the question of, will I still have a job with the advent of AI, right? A lot of people are very scared of that. And, maybe to some extent with reason, because we know that jobs will disappear. We know that new jobs will come, but we don't really know how many will disappear and how many will come, and there won't be a perfect overlap in terms of skills. It might also be that, a job disappears and that it takes potentially years before, you get a new job. So while in the overall picture, the net losses and benefits might be okay, which also that we don't know, for one person, a human being who has to sustain his family, it's a big issue, right? If that person loses his or her job. So that is also one of the main pillars that we are working on. Now, this is not an EU level competence, right? So in the European Union, it's a supranational organization. Some competences are at European level, some competences are still at member state level. This one is mostly member state. So what we are doing is working with member states on adopting policies that can help, right? So policies around reskilling, upskilling, training, education. So these are the kind of things. And ultimately, we will need to think of social security systems and whether we need to rethink those social frameworks, right? Then the last pillar, and that's the one I'm going to focus on most in this presentation, is ensuring an ethical and legal framework for AI, or an adequate ethical and legal framework, because it's not that there is no legal framework. Very often people think that AI is not regulated at all because, well, there is not one big AI law, so that should mean that AI is not regulated. That's not really true. Can anyone give me an example of a law regulation that already applies to AI today? Yeah. One of the most obvious examples, yeah. It already applies today to AI. So you cannot say that AI is not unregulated. Another example? Non-discrimination rules, right? We have all this idea of AI should not be biased, right? One of the biggest challenges of AI is that it can make biased decisions because it works on historical data or societal data that is often biased. People are not allowed to discriminate, right? We have non-discrimination rules in place for that. We have that on European level, we have that on national level, we have that, concretely for the workplace, we have that for many different areas. But that also applies to AI in the sense that it applies to the people who develop and use AI. So I cannot hide behind an AI system when I make a discriminatory decision for someone, right? So that already exists. Now the question is, of course, one rather of enforcement. Because that is what is difficult, especially when we talk about bias, right? Because you need to know that it exists and you need to know how to enforce it. That's my personal view, yes. So that's what I say, it's a question of enforcement. So let me rephrase, it's not that one cannot, but one should not. That's what I meant. One should not hide behind an AI system because the rule already applies to you, whether you're making the decision yourself or whether you're using an AI system for it. But it's so much more difficult to spot that it happens when you use an AI system because you as a consumer or as a user impacted, you cannot verify that. Now it's true that also for human beings sometimes it's difficult to know, am I rejected for this job because my qualifications are not high enough or because he doesn't like my skin color or my gender or my age, whatever. But with an AI system, the challenge is that it happens also unintentionally. And that is problematic. So, but I'll come back to this unintentional part later. So this was just to say that it's not true that no legal rules already apply today to AI, but that doesn't mean that those rules don't need updating. To ensure that there are no loopholes, and also to ensure that we can enforce them appropriately, because that is an issue, right? And it's in that context, so especially the third pillar, that we set up a high-level expert group on artificial intelligence that I'll talk about later. Another background point that is quite important, coordination with member states. In Europe, we have all those different member states, still 28 at this moment, and we are much stronger if we leverage our efforts, right, at European level and make actions collectively, or at least coordinate what kind of actions we do. This is especially true in terms of investments, but also, for instance, for research, right? If we can couple our research centers and create networks of networks, we have more of a chance, I'll put it that way, than if we just stay at our own national level. So that's something that the Commission is trying to do. It set up a group with member states working on AI, and every year they will adopt a coordinated plan on AI. The first one came out last year, you can look it up. It contains around 70 action points that either member states or the Commission or both together will make around AI. And it tackles all these three pillars, right? So it's not just action on investment, it's also on what do we need in terms of data, infrastructure, skills, and potentially regulation, right? So it tries to cover all of that. And each year, this plan is revised to take new impactful actions. So that's also something that we're doing. So in this third pillar, there's a lot going on, and there's much more than you will see on this slide, but just a few things that I would like to touch upon. So we also set up an expert group, for instance, that looks into safety and liability. Those are also rules that already apply to AI systems today, but also rules that might need an update, right? For safety, we know that AI can actually help a lot to make, for instance, the work environment much more safe, but it can also have a negative impact. So we need to make sure that the safety standards are still up to date for AI systems. The same with liability. There it's also a question of how do you interpret the current liability rules when you apply them to AI systems, right? Because do they apply to the product itself? Who do you make liable? Because often an AI system is complex and it consists of different components that come from, different people. And if I'm a user and I bought an AI system and I teach it bad language, so to say, am I liable? Is it the producer liable who allows the AI system to learn bad words? There are a lot of questions there. But these questions are important to solve, because if I, as a producer, don't know that I will not be held liable for everything that the user does with it, am I even going to put the system on the market, right? So those are questions that we need to find out what we do with them. And there will be interpretative guidance on this liability framework coming soon. Then another big one is the European AI Alliance. Who of you is familiar with the European AI Alliance? Not many people. So when you walk out of this meeting later, you Google the European AI Alliance, you register, it's for free. Basically, it's an online platform. It's a multi-stakeholder platform that brings together citizens, organizations, for-profit, not-for-profit, academia, so researchers. And the idea is, first of all, to inform through the alliance of the actions that the Commission is undertaking in AI. But more importantly, it's a forum for input. So if you have a paper or a document related to AI that you want to upload there and share with the community, it counts over 3,000 members by now. Or if you want to share an idea for policy making, you say, I think it's really important, for instance, that we set up a certification system for AI systems. You can put it there on the forum, and you can engage into a discussion with members of the expert group, with the Commission, and especially with other people of the community. So it's kind of trying to gather stakeholders around AI policy in Europe. So if that interests you at all, consider becoming a member. It's very easy and it's useful to stay up to date and to give your input. And the last bullet point, I'll also dive into a bit deeper. There are issues at national level, there are issues at European level, but a lot of the challenges that AI poses are global. So we need global solutions for that. Even European level is not enough. So what we are trying to do is also talking with countries like Japan, Singapore, Canada, who are also thinking a lot about the ethical issues around AI. I mention these because they already adopted also ethics guidelines, which are very much in line with ours. There are also other countries out there in the world that are starting to work on ethics guidelines or that have maybe a little bit different perspectives. I'll put it that way. So, but it's important that we also reach global consensus on certain issues. So we're trying to do that by talking with countries, but also other international organizations. So the OECD recently adopted guidelines on AI. UNESCO said it's going to work on AI guidelines. It's very in to work on AI ethics guidelines for the moment. So those will not be the only ones that you will encounter. But that's also one of the reasons why the European Commission said, let's do something at the European level. Because we also saw that a lot of member states started to adopt, their own ethics framework. And the idea is nice, of course, because it's important to take that into account. But if you want to have a single European market and make sure that my product that I produce in Belgium can be used in France or in Germany and is not held to other ethical standards, then it's better to do something at European level. That was a little bit the reasoning behind it. So, yes? Voluntary. Yeah. So yeah, the question of Tommy was that I said we want to make sure that AI systems are not held to a different ethical standard in different countries, but that wording kind of implies that you're mandatorily held to an ethical standard, whereas ethics should not be something mandatory. It complements law. So yes, it complements law, but first of all, it can inspire legal rules. And I would not be surprised if, these ethics guidelines, which indeed are voluntary, would inspire some sort of binding regulation. Secondly, I think a lot of organizations might feel that they should comply with these guidelines or other guidelines, even if it's not mandatory, because it shows consumers, it gives them a sign of, hey, you can trust my product, you can trust my service. Because I took these things into account, so and as a consumer, I might be willing to pay a little bit more for that product than for a product that I know they will breach my privacy, they will not let me make my own decisions. So in that sense, I mean, sure, it's in principle this is voluntary, but it's useful that these standards are the same, even if it's about voluntary standards, because it has an impact on the market. So Ethics 101. I bet you guys probably don't have, a background in ethics. So I'll be very brief about this, but I think it's useful to just explain some basic distinctions because we talk so much about AI ethics nowadays. So I just want to, give you a sense of what that means. So applied ethics, normative ethics, meta-ethics are different things. So applied ethics is when you talk about norms, ethical norms, and you try to make a rational justification of these norms. You try to rationalize them. You think about them. Why this norm and not another norm? And applied ethics means you do that for a specific application. For instance, abortion. You try to make sense of the ethical norms around abortion, right? And you try to see, is there a justification for rather going this way or another way? Versus normative ethics, this is more trying to make a justification or reflection on ethical norms more generally. What is the good life? What does it mean to live in society together? Why should we not lie to each other, right? Why should we give all citizens a voice? So applied ethics is a particular problem. It can be AI, it can be abortion, it can be genome editing. Versus normative ethics is broader. And then meta-ethics is when you try to reflect on the justification that you make. So that's another level. Then you have social ethics versus individual ethics. Anyone wants to have a go at what the difference is? Yeah, more than determined, it would rather be what are the norms that we think we should apply when we are in a social context. right? So what are the norms that apply between neighbors, in society, democracy, versus individual ethics? What are the norms that I think I should apply to myself? What is the good life for me? What is a right or a wrong action when it comes to my individual life, right? So it's social versus individual. And then a last distinction is you have practical philosophy or ethics, which is practical, versus theoretical philosophy. So the questions you raise there are different. So with practical philosophy, the question is, what should the good life be for me, for society? Theoretical philosophy would rather be, what is the meaning of life? Right? What does it mean to be a human being? So you see, it's much more theoretical, which is also a whole philosophical branch. When we talk about AI ethics, and that's why I'm doing this whole little story, we are talking about ethics or practical philosophy. It can be looked at from a social or an individual perspective, but we are talking about applied ethics. So we apply our reasoning on ethical norms to a particular area, which is artificial intelligence. Okay? Now, throughout history, there have been many ethical theories. I put on the slide the 3 big ones that you probably already heard of. There have been many others, and there are many subcategories under these. But these are important when we think about how we want to also apply them to AI and how we want to live in a world with AI. So just to go over them briefly. Deontologism is all about what is the rule, a moral rule that you need to obey. It's closely associated with Kant. You probably heard of Kant already, our dear Immanuel Kant. And for him, the right approach, or the right ethical approach, is you follow a moral duty that you have. So it's not that you happen to act ethically, that you wanted to do something and, oh, it's also the ethical thing to do, so that makes me an ethical person. No, it's the fact that you acted because you know it's the right thing to do. You have a moral duty to act. And it's about following the rule, whatever the consequence. So to put it to the extreme, if there is a rule that says you should not lie, which we as a society kind of agree that it's a good rule, you should always apply it. And so Kant has also been ridiculized a little bit, because you can say, well, that means that if there is a murderer in front of your door with a knife and asks, where is your wife? You should not lie, right? So it's maybe a bit extremist, but for him it's really all about the rule, because it's principle-based. We don't care about the consequences. And that has an impact also when we talk about AI, because with artificial intelligence, the hope is a little bit that to some extent we can code legal and ethical rules into an AI system. We don't really know what the consequences will be necessarily, right? So just make that reflection. Then the second one that I put there is virtue ethics. It's closely associated with Aristotle. And the virtue ethics approach is, ethics, it's something that you practice, it's a habit, and you become better and better at it. So it's by making time and time again, being faced with an ethical dilemma or with a decision that you have to make and thinking, okay, what is the right ethical approach that I take here? That is how you become an ethical person. You need to practice it. You need to, be immersed in a situation and think, what is the best approach? What is the middle between 2 extremes? That's a little bit the thinking behind that. If we link that to, for instance, AI policy making, you would say that if we would regulate everything, regulate what an AI system, what you can and cannot do with an AI system, you just follow the rule. But you don't get to practice anymore. You don't get to really make the reflection of, in this case, what would be the right thing to do. So how would you still have the freedom to become an ethical person? You need a little bit of freedom in order to make that reflection, right? Otherwise, you just, bam, you follow the rule. You don't even ask the question, is this ethical to do or not? And then we turn into a society that just blindly follows rules, hopefully good ones, I don't know. So that's also something to keep in mind. Then the third big theory, consequentialism, it's the opposite than the first one in a way, because it's all about the consequences, right? We only evaluate the value, the worth of an act if we think that the consequences of that act are ethically valuable or correct, as opposed to another one. It's closely linked with utilitarianism, for instance. Okay? And that again also has implications, because in AI you set a certain goal, right? You try to optimize reaching a certain goal or consequence, but you don't really know how the system will get to that goal. And I mean, there are websites, funny websites, which try to document, you know, the kind of loopholes that AI systems sometimes take in order to reach a certain goal, right? So that's also something that is nice to think of. There are many more ethical theories, and I think there is not going to be one, truthfully one, that will give us an answer, but it's useful to be aware of these theories, so that because they give a rational explanation of why rather going for this than another approach, and you should be able to combine them maybe in different situations. Maybe let me stress that ethics is not about saying, ooh, my gut tells me that we should go for that. It's really about, you know, finding these moral intuitions, but then finding a rational explanation for them. And too often in the ethical debate, you know, you see statements being made on, oh, that's not ethical, or that's the right way to do, but you don't see the justification for that. That's not ethics. You need to have some sort of theory. The theory can also be, there is no theory, right? But you should be able to ground that somehow. And that's very important when we are going to have societal debates on when or how to use AI. Because in those debates, we should be able to ask, especially policymakers, but also others, what is your reasoning behind that? Right? Because if we don't have that, then what is our basis to discuss? And there is a lot to discuss. Right? Who of you is familiar with the trolley problem? Okay, quite a few. So this is, philosophers love this problem because it poses a lot of questions. So the situation is you have a train or a car, or, you know, if you don't do anything, the train will go forward and 5 people will die. But there is a second track, and you are the person there in the middle next to the handle. And if you undertake an action and pull the handle, the train will go to the second track and only 1 person will die. How many of you would pull the handle? Okay. Because you would say it's better that just 1 person dies over 5, right? What if it's your mom? Or your wife, or your child? I mean, it would probably still be rational if the reasoning is 5 versus 1 to do that, right? Especially if all we care about is the outcome. Sorry? You don't know. Yeah. So and it also means that you have to actually take an action, right? You become kind of responsible for someone's death. So you can imagine philosophers love this because it raises so many questions. Now, newly, this has started to become relevant or quasi-relevant for AI systems. Why? Autonomous vehicles. Now, they're not there yet, autonomous vehicles, fully autonomous vehicles. And, you know, despite giving this example, it's a little bit of a fake example. It shows that people who are building cars or AI systems more generally, they will have to code some decisions into the technology. So they will have to ask themselves also questions of what is the consequence of this and this action. So there will be some ethical thinking there. But today we are not yet in the situation that cars drive fully autonomously and would need to make that decision. But maybe one day they will. Now then another reasoning is, yes, okay, but imagine it's not a self-driving car, but it's you behind the wheel. Do you know what you would do in that situation? Like you have the split of a second and you need to decide whether you go left or right. Probably you would know in the moment itself, or you would not, you know, rationally think, but, you know, your instincts would do something. So there are people who said, let's just randomize whatever the car should do in such a situation, because there is no, but that's not really ethical either. It's not a really ethical reasoning, but you know. Are you familiar with the, yeah? Yeah. You anticipate what I'm going to say. Yeah. So in fact, there is a moral machine experiment. You can Google moral machine. It's pretty interesting. It's researchers at MIT that started it, but also a few others. And what they try to do with this problem of who should I kill, the 5 or the 1, or your mom, or you know, your friends, they try to gather data from millions of people on this issue, millions of people living in 150 or so different countries. They build a website for this. They let you experiment with the website. You can go, you can click, and you know, decide the option that you would take, and you can play with it a little bit. So here in the example, you know, they for instance ask, who would you kill, or who should the autonomous car kill? The old person or the kid? Yeah, in that case there is no, you're not in the car, but there is another example of that, yeah. So, but that's a different point. So that's the argument of, ooh, should we even have autonomous vehicles on the street? Because sometimes accidents happen, like we saw. Yes, but we also have, you know, regular cars on the street, and the risk level of being killed with regular cars is way higher than it will be with autonomous vehicles. So that should not be something to stop us, even though psychologically it's a new thing. So we're like, ooh, no, whenever one accident happens, we freak out. Although, you know, it would be interesting actually to see, since that accident happened, how many people died on the road throughout the world. Many more. But it's still something different, because even if you have many more lives saved because you use autonomous vehicles, you will still have these kind of dilemmas. That's a little bit the idea. And what this study tried to map is, do people answer this question differently in different world regions? And what do you think the answer was? Yeah. So there were not major differences, and not on everything. But for instance, on this one, in more Asian societies, where there is a lot of respect and reference for older people, you would save the elderly person. Not everyone, of course, but you saw this tendency, whereas in more European countries, the tendency would be much rather, well, that person is well on his or her way out anyway, so you know, let's save the young person, right? And there were other differences like that, yeah. So they did so many different instances where, you know, they crossed legally or illegally, or they put the old person versus a child, or the old person versus 2 adults. So they did a lot of these things, but on average, so without looking at this one, but on average, when confronted between an older person and an adult or a child, sometimes they would save the older person more often. And again, this is in the margin, right? So it's not that all of them opted for that all the time, but it showed these type of tendencies. Also there it showed the type of tendencies that you would rather sometimes kill someone who crossed the street illegally, rather than someone who crossed legally, even though, you know, it's 5 illegal people versus 1 legal person, for instance. So I mean, I invite you to experiment yourself. Here is the example of, would you rather kill yourself? Or would we, if we agree with, the few people there who agree that I would pull the handle because I would rather save 5 versus 1. Actually, what we would want then in this situation is ask car producers to program the car as such that if confronted with this situation, it kills its driver. Question is whether you would buy a car that is programmed like that. But, if we as a society would say this is what we think is right because we want to save the largest number, then... So some people really love dogs or cats more than human beings as well, but let's say that those are outliers. So the idea is that there is a level of ethical relativism, which means that the justifications behind the ethical rules might differ from culture or region, etc. That makes it difficult for us, right, to come to then global solutions for that, or European solutions even. That is opposed to the idea of moral universalism, which is there is something objective that we can all, say that yes, this is the ethical thing to do. And probably the closest that comes to something morally objective are fundamental rights or human rights. Because that is something, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a large number of countries, a very large number of countries accepted that, right? They don't all enforce it in the same way, but at least they acknowledge that that is something important. And that's what the expert group also decided to use as the basis for their ethics guidelines, because of that idea. I just need to see the time, because I don't have an idea of the... Okay, thank you. And the last bullet there is ethical skepticism. Anyone wants to venture on what that is, as opposed to relativism, universalism? There is no justification.
Do it like that.
Yeah, that's better, yeah.
So why would we think ethics anyway? Because what's the value of all that?
Yeah. So an ethical skepticist would say it's not, it's not that the justification is different in each culture. It's just there is no justification. But it doesn't matter. You can invent rules because they don't really exist anywhere out there, and the justification for them doesn't really exist anywhere out there. So there is no justification, which is a little bit scary in society, and we don't work like that because it doesn't give us predictability. You need to understand that ethical norms are kind of the mental infrastructure of our society. Right? It's because of these ethical norms that we trust each other on a day-to-day basis, cross each other on the street, and I don't fear that you will immediately kill me, for instance, right? Because we have some sense of ethical right and wrong that we share. And then the question, what do you want to govern with ethics? What do you govern with law? Right? And that will be a question that will be very relevant for policymakers as we go along, because there are some things that would be prone to regulation. There's some things where we might not be ready to regulate yet, or it's not necessary to regulate it, and that we would maybe rather leave for ethics. So that's also an open question. Now, more quickly on the high-level expert group. So it consisted of 52 experts. I coordinated them. And as you see, they come from diverse backgrounds. Industry, it counted bigger companies, smaller companies from different sectors. Academia, professors in law, ethics, philosophy, psychology, engineering, computer science, bit of everything. And then civil society, consumer organization, trade union, NGOs, fundamental rights agencies, a bit of everything. So quite... Sorry?
No creative people?
What do you mean with creative?
Musicians, artists.
We actually wanted to have someone like that, but I think we had just one application, and then that person didn't make it. Yeah. Not of enough people. Yeah. Although on the European AI Alliance now, we do have people talking a lot about AI and art, which is quite nice. Yeah. So, a pretty diverse group, even without a musician. So, pretty difficult to, bring them all together, talk the same language, and try to find consensus around something as easy as ethics for AI, right? And they have 2 deliverables. Beside the guidelines that came out, they also have policy and investment recommendations. So on how to make Europe also competitive in AI. And what kind of more regulatory issues might need to be dealt with beside the guidelines which are voluntary, non-binding. And of course they interact with the alliance. Yes?
So these 2 or just 2 action points out of the 70 of the entire yearly action?
They're actually not part of this yearly coordinated plan. They're part of the strategy which came out in April. So in April you had the big strategy with the 3 pillars that I explained. As part of that strategy we said we need to coordinate member states. We will start adopting an annual plan. That's one thing. We need to understand better the ethical issues. We will set up a high-level expert group on AI and we will give it 2 documents to work on. Guidelines and recommendations. The guidelines are meant for AI practitioners, so developers, deployers of AI. The recommendations are meant for the Commission and for member states. What are the actions they should undertake? And the group also interacts with the European AI Alliance. So that's why I'm saying if you're interested in that, become a member and consider contributing in that sense. So for the guidelines, that's the process. We had a first draft ready in December. There was a consultation. We got about 500 people who commented on that. Quite substantive comments often, which was great because it meant they really engaged with the text. Less great if you were the one who had to go through all of these comments. We had then a revised document in March, handed it over to the European Commission because it's not a commission, it's an independent expert group, right? It was appointed by the Commission. But the Commission liked this document. So they then adopted a communication on AI in which they said, look, we welcome this work and we support the 7 key requirements that the experts propose that AI systems should meet. And we warmly encourage all stakeholders, organizations to try to implement these requirements somehow, right? What's in these guidelines? First of all, the term that they use is trustworthy AI and not ethical AI. And that is because the experts said it's not just about being ethical. And now we come back to the example I gave at the very beginning. You can have the best ethical intentions. For instance, your intention is, when I hire a person, I want to take more objective decisions because I know that I'm biased and my buddy is biased because he likes pretty girls, whatever, right? We know that human beings are biased and AI systems can help us to make less biased decisions. So I will use an AI system to go through all the CVs and put candidates forward. Good ethical intentions, but because I use historical data, I can have bias. And I can actually have maybe an even more or a less, but still a biased decision coming out of that AI system. Unintentionally. It's not because I wanted to discriminate, right? So that is an issue. And that's why the group said, first of all, AI needs to be lawful. Because there are rules in place and it needs to respect these legal rules. Second, it needs to be ethical. It needs to comply with our ethical principles and values. But it also needs to be robust. And then we very much come also to the technical part of it. You need to ensure your technical robustness, the quality, the integrity of your data. Did you check for biases, right? Did you ensure that your AI system cannot just be hacked? Because, okay, good intentions, but if someone can just take all the data out of it, you also have a problem, right? So it's these 3 elements, 3 components that they found important.
One thing that comes to my mind that I haven't heard or maybe don't hear as much. If you look at GDPR, there's this stick basically of punishment. Well, what about reward systems? Yeah. So like if you are treating things in the rightful, trustful way, and you realize impact. Just like we have impact on bad quality of air or something like that, and we get rewarded for that by giving tax credit or something. So as a company, you can save on CO2 levels, for instance, and you can prove it, and then you get a reward for that. So that reward mechanism is there. With ethical IE, this is touching these kind of levels as well of impact on many levels, like you said, societal, economic, etc. So has there been some thoughts in this work group on this topic?
Yeah. So it's a little bit tricky because this is something you expect people to do in any case, right? So it's to some extent it's difficult to say, well, of course we don't want bias, and then to say, wow, you ensured that there is no bias, you didn't discriminate people, wow, you know. On the other hand, yeah, you're right, they at this stage today they still need to do an effort to get there. Especially if we talk about technical robustness, and it can be costly to implement these kind of processes. So the thinking behind that is, if you go through these guidelines, if you apply that, if you make the effort, you can tell your consumers and your customers, my AI is ethical, buy my AI, and that can become a competitive advantage for you. And that can distinguish you and the efforts you made from someone who didn't do that. Then the question is, of course, how do you make that visible, right? How can I as a consumer know that you did all these efforts?
Yes, it's like a label, a quality label, like you mentioned before. And you as a, let's say, a company, you can acquire points as an impact score, like they do it on other levels. And if they can prove that accumulated effort has benefits towards consumer, towards competitors, to compare to the lawmakers, which can, or let's say not lawmakers, but politicians or whatever, creating a law which enhances or stimulates this behavior.
So that's an idea that is going around a lot, a sort of trustworthy AI label. Not everyone is a fan of that, because some people say, well, first of all, if you do that, you also need to have a mechanism that can then verify with those companies whether they actually did that. Because otherwise, it's a PR exercise, right?
Provide with GDPR also you prove your compliance. This thing is a lot more complex.
That's it.
And you still, you have to prove on so many different levels that you are compliant. So.
And that is a big difficulty, because first of all, with the GDPR, we have the DPAs. Do we have an equivalent for AI? Not today. Because it's about more than just privacy. That's the thing. Privacy is one aspect. So that's the first issue. Second issue, it's one thing to, try to comply with the GDPR, which are, legal rules, even though also some open issues there. But how do you prove compliance with ethical rules? How can you verify that kind of compliance? How can you check that? Because typically for a label or a certification, you need some sort of standards or concrete criteria that can then be checked by an independent authority that gives you the label of the standard. So while people think it is a good idea, and there are some voices going towards that, also on the European AI Alliance, and I think it's not a bad idea to post it there, because it shows that someone else also thinks it's a good idea, and that will make the ball rolling again. To do that in practice, it's going to be very difficult, because you need to basically invent a new oversight mechanism, which scares a lot of people, and you need to give that oversight mechanism the competences, the technical competences as well, and so the criteria, the standards on evaluating that. So, and that is going to be a challenge.
Yeah, particularly with this kind of mechanism, what you see with GDPR as well, and many other systems in our world, it stands or falls with the actual checking, right?
Yeah.
And since we do sample checking and not even very statistically significant mostly, there's a lot of room for abuse.
And that's why quite a lot of consumer
I like the reward system more, because you could say You could say everybody is supposed to be ethical, right?
Mhm.
So that's right. But then you reward the ones who are actually doing a great effort and stand out.
But then you would still need to verify that.
Only the ones that are being awarded.
But on what basis do you award them?
That's to be defined. Yeah, but that can be done by the public more than an authority.
Because one of the issues is that the public doesn't necessarily know very well. So it's, yeah. I mean, to me, the two things here, they pose similar questions. Maybe it can be a little bit easier to do it that way, but still, you would need to do the whole reflection on what are the criteria, right? And it's tricky.
Like the OECD last week, which has also adopted
Guidelines, yeah.
guidelines with principles and also recommendation to policymakers.
Yeah.
And I would like, maybe this is a tricky question, but how do you see the positioning itself in this kind of
Yeah.
discussion?
So we were actually involved in the OECD
Okay.
guidelines, so we try to coordinate on that. Okay, so yeah, I'll repeat it. So the lady mentioned that the OECD recently came out with ethics guidelines, actually last week, I believe. So the question was, how do you position yourself with that, and how does that work? So the reply is that the OECD, it's intergovernmental in the sense that it consists of different governments, and the European Commission is part of that, as well as the member states of the European Union, and we were also part of that process. Because we were part of that process, we made sure that there is a convergence between the principles. So if you will see the OECD principles, first of all, you'll see they're quite similar because we were involved. And second, they're complementary. It's not exactly the same because those principles are meant for member states, not for AI practitioners as such. And these guidelines, and we come here to the different chapters, and we have chapter 3, which is an assessment list with very concrete questions for AI practitioners to understand, what kind of actions did I undertake or not. That's also something that these OECD guidelines do not have. They don't go into that much detail. Otherwise, you would not have countries like, Belgium and the US, for instance, adopting them. So it's a good first step to come towards a global consensus, and they're very in line with that, but it remains at a higher level. So maybe at chapter 1, a little bit chapter 2, but it doesn't go into the concrete details of chapter 3. So, but the Commission's position is that since it was part of it, it welcomes these efforts, and that could really be the starting point to come towards a global consensus, because you already have countries like the US, Singapore on board. Yes.
Beingness. Can you have a degree of ethical beingness? So, for instance, I run through the list. I want to make the IE. I go through the list, and I try to do my best to comply with every point I find, but I cannot make it all the way.
Yeah, at this stage, this list is meant to help you to become or be more ethical. It's not meant to say, oh, not ethical, out. Yes, ethical, because it's not going to be black and white, especially not at this stage. Honestly, I think it's impossible at this stage for any organization to be able to comply with all of these things. Maybe the Googles or the Microsoft that have big teams that can work on it, but even they, also because there are some ambiguous questions in there that are not black and white. And at this stage, the purpose is not to say, yes, you're good, yes, you're bad. What we're trying to do now is to understand to which extent is this list helpful to you. So we're assessing the assessment list. We're not assessing compliance level of companies. But in that sense, yes, there is probably a range to which, you can say, yeah, I already do these things, and there are still points that I need to work on, for instance. But that is, that's your thing. We're not going to come and assess you.
Well, I hope so, because it sounds like creating a new religion, and the more points you get, the better salvation you have. Do you want to go in that direction? Anyway, that's a side remark. On the issue of do we need global organizational mechanisms, OECD or whatever, is there something similar on how to say it, major capital level or or city level? I know, for instance, that San Francisco has taken certain bylaws, local laws, to avoid using face recognition for the police force. So that's on a local or
in Europe, not that I'm aware of. I know that there have been also some cities who adopted their own AI strategies. So you do have action on regional level. But for these ethical aspects, not that I'm aware of, no. And to some extent, it would be more desirable that there is something, as I said, digital single market, something more horizontal. And I guess you could have both, right? You could have probably a horizontal layer and then specifications tailored to your specific context, because from one city to another, you can also have different issues, right? But at this stage, not that I'm aware of, yeah.
Are there any other geos or continents or countries that already have something that they are using?
Other countries that have ethics
like
guidelines?
USA or China? Or
Japan.
actually
Japan has ethics guidelines. Canada has something close. Singapore has ethics guidelines. Dubai has ethics guidelines. China is working on ethics guidelines, so I heard last week. So yeah, there are a number of companies who are coming up with that, and that's also why the OECD, try to pull these together and try to find something similar. Now, China is not part of the OECD, and UNESCO is now trying to do the same, but UNESCO has China but not the US. So, but yes, a lot of countries are starting to develop that, and that's why on my previous slide I said we are in close interaction with at least those countries where there is some affinity, because it makes sense to, and actually they're pretty similar. I mean, none of them have this practical assessment list that we have, because we really insisted on making it operational. But when you look at the principles, we can live with them.
The reason I asked is because China and US are the front leaders of AI development. So and they don't have anything.
No, so
or
the US...
China is now starting.
China is now starting, but they might be a bit different, their ethical principles. For the US, it's actually mostly from the industry driven. So it's industry who is adopting their own guidelines because the government is not doing it. Now, they did adopt the OECD guidelines. So they're now saying, we adopted the OECD guidelines. But again, as I said, it's level 1, level 2. So it's not detailed, it's high-level principles. And Chatham House rules, probably the only reason why they did that, it's being filmed, that's okay. But one of the reasons why they might have done it, I'll put it that way because I don't know, there is kind of a fear that if Europe is the first one who has ethics guidelines, like the GDPR, Europe will set the standard. So it's in their interest to actually join OECD, UNESCO, or other initiatives, because this way they're part of the gang, right? And it's still high level. Now, I think it's a very good thing that they adopted that, also because we worked on the OECD guidelines, and there's proper material in there, but they don't go to the operational level. And it's clever to do that, because they can say we have something. It's not very operational though. But that might still come, right? Early days in general, yeah.
I'm not sure if you are familiar with the case of, I watched once the presence of Elon Musk at Joe Rogan's podcast, and he mentioned that he was trying to convince the government of US to already apply some regulations in case of AI, and he shared that it was pretty hard to convince them to do anything at that time. So he summarized it that it's already too late, and for sure there will be people dying because of that. Do you think that it really is the case that's already too late, or there is still a chance to properly prepare for the future?
It's a tough question because there is a high level of uncertainty. With Elon Musk, I think he's not, when he talks about people dying, he's not necessarily thinking of regulating bias or even facial recognition, but rather regulating a potential more super intelligence or and I frankly don't know whether that's going to be there or not, and if so, I also don't know how far away that is. I just know that for policymakers, it's very difficult to regulate something that doesn't exist yet. So you can, of course, try to anticipate that to a certain extent, but whether it would be effective to already create regulation around that. Now, one of the things you could say is, well, you could adopt regulation on prohibiting research into artificial general intelligence, right? You could say we just prohibit even working on that. Is that going to be effective? We know that in China they will keep on doing it. We know that in the US they'll keep on doing it. And we know that in many other countries they would keep on doing it. So in a sense, what we're trying to do with these ethics guidelines, which is, you know, starting small, voluntary, is already to set a certain framework of in which you would like these systems to operate. So I don't know whether it's too late, but I know that at this stage this is the best we can do. And we will learn as we go, and we might, you know, adopt binding regulation for some areas when we learn that this is the right thing to do. But for those kind of issues, I don't see a solution yet.
As a technology of an AI, trying to set up the ethics and law itself. I know that here in Brussels there is a EU Datathon. I'm not so sure about what it exactly tackles, but is there already some system that actually can regulate the law a little bit and try to help to write the rules for
Regulate itself.
Yes.
Yeah. So I'm not a technical expert in AI, but I would say no. You can, to some extent, you can try to code. And I wouldn't even say ethical, but maybe let's say really legal rules into AI systems. Even in no AI systems, but in other systems, if you think about this technology, I would be always so frustrated about that. A DVD player who doesn't play DVDs that come from another country because they're copyright protected. It's already a sort of implementing regulation into technology, right? So you could think of something like that for AI systems. But it's a very clear thing. If you want to implement respect human dignity, how would you do that, right? And in a way, one of the big issues with AI systems is that they're too stupid today to have their own ethics, because the idea would be that if they're really, you know, so smart as human beings and they would also be able to adopt ethical rules, we wouldn't have an issue. Our issues is because of the fact that they're stupid. They don't recognize that they're biased. They don't recognize that they can do harm because they're just tools that we are programming, right? Okay, I'll move on a little bit because I think we are running a bit late. These are the 4 principles, relatively high level. You can read all about them. I'm not going to dwell into that, but as you see, you know, relatively high level ethical principles. And these are based on the fundamental rights, because as I said, the experts try to take fundamental rights as a sort of, you know, foundation for the guidelines, because this is something that is already quite accepted. From these 4 principles, they derived 7 key requirements that AI systems should meet in order to be trustworthy. Many of these requirements are to some extent already touched upon in law as well, right? Maybe not fully, maybe the law needs to be updated, maybe there would need to be new rules, but so that's the framework. And the idea is to go over these requirements throughout the system's life cycle, so from the very design phase. You don't just build your AI system and then at the very end say, ooh, does it comply with these requirements? You check that at the very beginning. You try to take that into account because this way you can try to design it into your system. Exactly. Ethics by design, privacy by design, security by design, that whole thing.
How would that look in a quantum computer?
Sorry, Ina?
How in a quantum computing environment?
That's a good question.
Because with quantum, obviously, there is no trace on how it derives its solutions.
I mean,
So you need, the only way you can do this is filtering, which is limiting the output.
Mm. So, again, not a technical expert, but there are also some people who say similar reasoning to black box AI systems or deep learning systems, right? They say you cannot have an explanation. We don't know what a system does. Okay, but you're not going to tell me that you cannot put inside an oversight mechanism. That you try to map to which extent is it important that I or human being intervenes when a decision is being taken. You cannot tell me that you're not going to do checks on technical robustness and safety, even if you have a black box. Privacy, you know which data goes in, you know which data you're training the system on, and you can, verify the output, even if you don't know what's happening in between. Transparency. That's tricky because under transparency we have traceability, explainability, and communication. Yet, explainability is going to be a challenge. But traceability, you can trace and keep logs of the data that went in, of how you treated that data, of the training data, of how you built the algorithm, how you verified it. And a big one under transparency.
But by that time, the old man is dead. You can check it in the logs, right?
So that's why we want them to check that from the design phase onwards, so from the very beginning. And yeah, sure. I mean, it would be too late for a guy today.
I understand the desire, but I think it's impossible technically for the moment.
But if you
For
build...
if it's quantum computing, right? I mean, if it's regular computing, no problem. You can filter it.
So, I don't know how much time we have, but I would suggest that this discussion we leave for a little bit later. Yeah, we have a question there.
Well, I'm seeing that there is no separate requirement like gender equality, or is it included
Diversity.
in the diversity? But there is no separate one, because I mean, as you know, one of the UN sustainability goals is the gender equality. So there is no gender mainstreaming in terms of.
So gender. So if you read the document, gender comes forth into the fairness and the diversity, but in multiple ways. So it means ensuring that your data is inclusive. And ensuring that your decisions are fair and take into account. The reason that you don't have there just gender is because with the expert group they said, yeah, gender is important, but you should also not discriminate based on age or disability. We also had someone from a disability advocacy group there. So it's very important, but it's not a requirement as such, because it belongs to ensuring that there is no bias, that you take that into account. Yeah. So I just explained the fifth one. Then societal and environmental well-being. Try to ensure that your AI is also environmental friendly. We know that it uses up a lot of energy. When you store data, it's a lot of energy. So I mean, sure, you need to balance there, but who cares that we have ethical AI systems if we don't have a planet anymore, right? That's the idea. And then finally, accountability. Did you ensure a mechanism for redress? Right? If you want to contest the AI decision, if it impacts you, can an individual try to contest it, right? What are the solutions there? Did you ensure that someone is accountable for that decision? Right, that you cannot hide behind, oh, it's not me, it's the AI system that took that decision. So, what we're doing right now is we started a pilot phase for the assessment list. So that's the third chapter. In the third chapter, for each of these 7 requirements that you saw, we have a set of questions that is aimed to help developers and deployers on verifying whether or not they took the right steps. And we want to understand, for different sectors, for different AI applications, for organizations of different sizes, also for smaller ones. Is this helpful? Is this set of questions complete? Other questions that are just not relevant. For instance, maybe there is no interaction with the consumer, and many questions might not be relevant in the first place, so it would be too burdensome to ask certain things. Are the questions clearly formulated, right? Is there ambiguity in them? So what we're doing now, we're launching this piloting because we want to assess the assessment list. We want to understand how can we improve the current assessment list. And for that, we need people who develop AI, who deploy AI, organizations, to give us feedback on the assessment list. You can register online. There will be an online survey. You fill it in, and the questions will be, you know, is this questionnaire complete? Are these questions irrelevant for you? You know, just to get a sense of feedback. We'll launch this on the 26th of June. There'll be an event. There will also be then the survey that will come online. And this will run until sometime in November. And then based on that feedback, we will have a revised assessment list in early 2020. Right? A few examples also of opportunities and critical concerns that the expert group identified. Because they also wanted to show how AI can be used for good, right? So it's not just about, oh, take care of risks. And then a note on the policy and investment recommendation. So as I said, there is a second document. The guidelines already were published in April. This one didn't come out yet. We are working on it. It will also be published on the 26th. And this is looking more at also competitiveness. So what are the recommendations from member states and the Commission on ensuring AI innovation, but also potentially updates in the regulatory system to ensure trustworthy AI? And these are the next steps. So as I said, we kick off the piloting June 26th. That is also the date that we will present the recommendations. We are trying to gather feedback, and a warm call to all of you, for all of you who know organizations or other people, you know, developing, deploying AI, to give feedback, because we need to understand how we can tailor that list now to concrete applications. The only way to get feedback is to actually apply it in practice. You take an AI application, you go through the assessment list, and you say whether it's useful or not, right? And then it's up to the new commission, because we're going to have a new commission after the elections, to decide what it does with it further, right? The status right now, it's just voluntary guidelines. The desire, you know, on the part of the expert group is that it remains voluntary guidelines, maybe with a sort of label system or open, but it might also be that it inspires some regulation, right? That on some issues, taking the example, for instance, in the US of the fact that chatbots need to self-identify themselves as an AI system. I think it was in California. So it's possible, right, that we will have something like that in Europe. So I'll stop there, because the conclusions are speaking for themselves, and take any other questions that you might have.
Other questions, because there have been a lot of questions so far. You can go.
Very quickly, the questions, are they open source? Can we use it in, let's say, in hackathons? Yeah?
I'm curious to hear if there is a difference in applicability if it's, for instance, for military deployment.
So the expert group, the guidelines in principle apply to all AI applications. They did not say for military there are different standards.
Some concerns with that, I can see it on your face.
I'm just stating the facts.
Do you see already some examples of AI systems that kind of breach these requirements? Do you have, while you're working through them, and say, oh, maybe this one is not so good, or maybe this one are better?
So I don't work with AI systems, but I think, you know, if you look at some examples that we heard in the media, let's say the Amazon AI system that was actually used to try to get more objective decision makings into hiring, it discriminated against women because they used historical data. There were less women working there, so obviously it was an easy one, in fact, to think of, but nobody thought of that. So that's an example. And I guess there are many others out there. And again, I think it's, I wouldn't at this stage say that breach the guidelines, because it's,
But
you know,
they're outside
Yeah,
of the ethical
I think,
ideas.
yeah, I think it's difficult at this stage to comply with all of them. Because one of the things also that we have in there is communication. And I think that's a very important one. Is saying, you know, when you put an AI system on the market or you deploy it, also communicate on what are the limitations of that AI system. The capabilities, but also the limitations. Which could also be, what is the level of accuracy that this AI system has? And this is not something, I mean, organizations are trying to be more transparent about how a certain decision is reached or how, but we are not there yet. And it would be surprising if we're there yet, because then you wouldn't really need those guidelines maybe. So the idea is now to understand through the piloting phase, where are we, right? And how can we implement it? Because, I mean, we worked on it hard and we have this assessment list, but it's still a bit of an open question how good that assessment list is and how much it captures really what you want to be implemented. Now, yeah, question.
Thank you. In the beginning, you told us that European Union wants to try to use this to give a competitive advantage. There are many different possibilities to have competitive advantages. I was very interested what the EU thinks. And is there also thought about the ones who fully ignore all of this and take that as an advantage, as you got some member countries who do that with tax law or with some other loopholes in order to get regional advantages?
Yeah.
Is that because I think the whole picture is
Yeah. So yeah, you could see it both ways, right? You could say you can get a competitive advantage by complying with this and telling your consumers I comply with this, but it comes at some cost because you need to, you know, incorporate that. And you can say, well, I gain a competitive advantage by not incorporating that and just doing my thing, being unethical and you know, making more profit. I don't know how sustainable that model is, because in Europe, the majority of people, because we are also, you know, we are raised, we get aware of these issues, right, from all sides. We do care about that. So if we then hear that a company is acting unethically, we act. And, you know, reputation takes a very long time to build up, but it's, you know, in one day you get in the media for something unethical that you did, and you can lose also a lot of market share, which some companies, you know, felt. But there is a sense that it would be good to have a level playing field, right? To get everyone being on the same level. And if you see that it doesn't happen with the ethics guidelines on a voluntary level, then what remains is to maybe adopt regulation for those areas where we really think that we need all companies to take that into account because it's important, and we don't want anyone to get profit from not doing it. So, but it would be nicer to first go the voluntary way, right?
So, how many answers, how many responses do you expect to get, and how many can you treat?
So right now, we already have around 250 organizations who registered, because registrations are open. For the first survey that we did, we had more than 500. I'd be very disappointed if we have now less than 500. I am hoping for 1,000 organizations, because we need to do a mapping of different applications in different sectors, and we need to do a mapping of organizations of different sizes. We cannot have just the Googles and the Microsoft filling in this questionnaire. We need to understand also what it means for a startup or an SME to go through that list, and how difficult it is in terms of resources as well to do that. And we will dedicate the resources for that on our end to go through this list and to then make the assessment to see how this can be improved, because it's valuable information. Not just to update the assessment list, but it's also valuable information for policymakers on whether they should, you know, go a little bit tighter, because it doesn't make sense to just leave it to the voluntary. So it's very useful don't worry about how difficult it will be to analyze that. I won't be the one doing it this time, so go for it.
So, do you know actually which European country is the most aware of AI risks? Moreover, the country which supports the development the most, because for now I heard just about France, I think, that supports financially the growth of AI. And also, if I ask about these countries, is Belgium high in this ranking? It's actually maybe the center.
So I'm sure there are some studies, but I don't know whether the European studies are rather international level, and then they tend to group then the European countries together, so I wouldn't know by heart. I know that Finland and the Nordics in general are scoring quite high on AI uptake and development and usability. In general, I don't think Belgium is doing that bad compared to other countries. We're also a country that already adopted some AI strategy, which other countries still need to do. But we, of course, have the issue that we are a little bit split. And that's a shame, because you can do much more if you would pull that together, right? We are trying to get coordinated on European level. It would be a shame if we would not coordinate more also at national level, but it's tricky. And I guess that would help. But we are not best of the class, but we're also not last of the class, I would say. And especially in terms of research, we have a very strong research basis. So.
Supported financially the development of AI?
No, definitely not. There are many countries who support the development. I mean, France came out with its strategy, and was it 1 billion? A big number. I don't remember. But Germany did the same, like just a little bit later. And each country is now adopting a strategy because the Commission asked them also to do so, where they put some numbers on the table. So it's and then there's also money coming from the European Union as well. Yeah.
I think you can leave the rest for when we have a drink. There's a few other announcements to be made. I'm going to try to do it with this mic. First, Eduardo put up this thing, slido.com. If you want to give feedback on the event today, you can do it there. You can do it now with your smartphone or at home. I'm going to try to make a sort of report of today on our website, BXL for Brussels, legalhackers.org. Yeah. So there should be a report, and maybe I can also post the slides there, if you don't object. So all the pictures of the slides, throw them away. You can have the actual slides. Maybe that's better. And what I also wanted to mention is we have a next event on the 4th of June, a completely different event, which has nothing to do with AI, but with legal startups. My list is on my computer, so I don't know them by heart. But it's 4 legal startups. We're going to meet them. They're going to present their trajectory and at what point they are at this point in time. And it's at La Phare du Canal, which is just across the canal, a little cafe, something like that. And you can find us on Meetup. The next one is 4th of June. We start at 6, but that's dinner included. If you come at 7:15, you'll be able to catch the speakers without, if you've eaten at home with your family, fine, of course. I think that's it for me. I invite you to go to the bar and have another drink. Continue the discussion if you want. Rob, you have another question? I'm sorry. That's slightly unspontaneous, but yeah, okay. Okay, you can continue the discussion at the bar with a drink, and I hope to see you at other events, if not on the 4th, perhaps afterwards. You can follow us on Twitter and on the website and on Meetup. Thank you very much for coming, and hope to see you again. Thank you.